The confrontation in Texas that transformed Chuck Norris from a poor, shy boy into a warrior. Fort Worth, Texas, March 1963. A Saturday afternoon, just after 2 o'clock. The sky over the Stockyards district was the particular shade of pale blue that exists only in the American Southwest in late winter, a color that has no warmth in it despite the sun that produces it, a color like the inside of something cold. The smell in the air was diesel and cattle and the faint sweetness of sorghum from the grain elevators 3 blocks east. A train was passing, somewhere behind the buildings, invisible, its horn sounding twice and then going quiet. On Exchange Avenue, a row of storefronts showed their Sunday faces on a Saturday, most of them shut or shuttered, and the few that were open had their doors propped wide and let out the smell of coffee and cigarette smoke and the particular indoor warmth of places that have been heated all winter by bodies and bad ventilation. The building at the far end of the block, past the feed supply and the saddle shop, had been a hardware store, and before that, a dry goods outlet. And before that, probably something else, the history of the building visible in its facade, the way the history of a tree is visible in its rings, successive coats of paint, each one slightly different from the last, the current one a faded cream that might once have been white. Above the door, mounted on the exterior wall, a wooden board had been recently painted with the words Norris Karate, in letters that were careful and even but not professional, the kind of sign made by someone who had done most things in life without the option of hiring someone else to do them. The sign had been up for 4 months. Chuck Norris had turned 23 years old 12 days earlier. He had been back from Korea for 14 months. He was 5 feet 10 and 168 pounds, and he was not, to look at, a man who attracted particular attention. He was lean rather than imposing. His face was specific and watchful and not given to expression, the face of someone who has grown up understanding that most expressions are expensive and most of the time the cost is not worth paying. He had the hands of someone who had worked with them, the knuckles thickened, the skin rough at the edges, but they were not large hands. He was not large. He was, to any reasonable eye, an ordinary young man running a small karate school on the unfashionable end of Exchange Avenue in Fort Worth, Texas, who had no money and no particular prospects, and whose school had, on its best week, 14 paying students. He had come to Fort Worth because his mother lived here now, having followed her second husband to Texas, after the years of movement that had defined Chuck's childhood, the periodic migrations from one cramped situation to the next that were the rhythm of growing up poor in America in the 1940s and 1950s. He had no deep connection to the city except that she was here and he was not yet ready to be too far from her, and Fort Worth was a place where a man could rent a space for what he could afford and attempt to build something, which was what he had come home from Korea determined to do. What he was building was not, to most observers, obviously worth building. The idea of a karate school in Fort Worth in 1963 required a kind of confidence in invisible things that bordered on stubbornness. There was no American karate industry to speak of. There was no tournament circuit of any significance. There was no infrastructure, no established pedagogy, no proven business model. There was a man who had learned something in Korea, who believed in that thing with a depth that was difficult to explain to people who had not felt it, and who was willing to spend his savings and his time on the proposition that other people might eventually recognize its value. This is not a story about certainty. It is a story about someone who was not certain about very much except the work itself, and who chose to keep doing the work anyway. The boy who had grown up in Oklahoma, in a house that shook when his father came home drunk, was not the man who ran the school on Exchange Avenue, but he was not far away either. He was there in the careful management of money, in the early mornings and the late evenings, in the way Chuck moved through the world without taking up more space than necessary. He was there in the slight hesitation before Chuck spoke to people he did not know, the fraction of a second in which he assessed the room and chose his register. He was there in the way Chuck never raised his voice, not because he was placid, but because he had learned very early that the raised voice in a small house late at night meant something was about to go wrong. He had been opening the school at 8 every morning, 6 days a week, since November. He taught classes in the morning and the evening and used the afternoon for his own training, which he approached with the same systematic rigor that he had developed in Korea under the instruction of Jae Chul Shin, who had taught him Tang Soo Do with a precision and a philosophical seriousness that had reoriented the way Chuck understood his own life. He kept a notebook in which he recorded his training sessions, the specific content of each workout, the things he was working on and the things that were giving him difficulty, and he reviewed this notebook at the end of each week and made adjustments. He was not improvising. He was building something, and building requires planning, and he planned. There were 3 men who came to the school on that Saturday afternoon in March. They had been there once before, the previous Saturday, when Chuck had a class in session, and they had stood in the doorway and watched for a few minutes before one of them asked when the regular class times were. Chuck had told them. They had nodded and left without introducing themselves. The one who spoke was named Roy Cavett. He was 27 years old and had grown up in Weatherford, 30 miles west, and had come to Fort Worth 5 years earlier to work at the conveyor plant building aircraft components. He was a large man, 6'2", and built like someone who had done physical labor all his life, which he had. He was not, by the standards of anyone who looked at him, a man who was used to being told no. He had a reputation in the particular social world he occupied, the bars and the pool halls and the weekend wrestling matches at the VFW Hall in North Side, as someone who could handle himself, and this reputation was not unfounded. He had handled himself on several occasions in ways that had ended badly for the other party. He was not malicious. He was not violent by nature. He was a man of his time and his place who had grown up understanding physical dominance as a legitimate form of currency, who had spent his adult life moving through a world that confirmed this understanding, and who had walked into a karate school on Exchange Avenue the previous Saturday with the specific curiosity of someone who wants to know whether a thing that looks fragile actually is. He had seen a young man in a white uniform moving in patterns that Cavett did not recognize and could not immediately categorize as useful or not useful in the terms he used to evaluate such things. The two men with him were not important to the story in themselves. They were witnesses. They were there because a man like Cavett performed his tests for an audience when he could arrange one. Their names were Gerald Sutton and Pete Almanza, and they worked at the same plant as Cavett, and they had come along on Saturday afternoon because they had nothing better to do and because Roy had said it might be worth seeing. Chuck was alone in the school when they arrived. The afternoon was his own time, and he had been working a form in the center of the floor for the preceding 40 minutes, moving through the sequence with the kind of unhurried repetition that looks, to an uninformed eye, either meditative or pointless. He heard the door and stopped and turned. Cavett came in first. Sutton and Almanza stayed near the door. Cavett looked around the school. He looked at the equipment on the walls, the bags, the wooden dummy in the corner, the framed certificates from Korean martial arts organizations that Chuck had hung near the entrance. He looked at them the way a man looks at things he is weighing for their significance or lack of it. Then he looked at Chuck. "You the one who runs this?" he said. "Yes," Chuck said. Cavett nodded. He moved a few steps further into the room. He was not menacing in any theatrical sense. He was simply a large man who occupied space with complete comfort and who was accustomed to having that comfort respected. "I was wondering if your stuff actually works," he said, "or if it's one of those things looks good in a movie and not much else." Chuck looked at him for a moment. He said, "What would help you answer that question?" Cavett smiled. It was a real smile, not a performance. "I figure if it works, you ought to be willing to show it against somebody that's not one of your students." There was a silence in the school. Sutton and Almanza stood near the door and did not move. Here is what was true about Chuck Norris at 23 years old. In March of 1963, in a small school on Exchange Avenue in Fort Worth, he had spent 4 years learning a system of fighting for men in Korea who understood fighting in a way that most Americans in 1963 had no framework for. He had practiced this system with the obsessive consistency of someone who had found, for the first time in his life, a thing that made sense to him entirely. A thing that rewarded effort in direct proportion to its quality, a thing that did not deceive and could not be faked. He had competed in Korea and won and lost and won again. He had been hit hard, and he had learned that being hit hard was not the thing he had feared it was when he was a boy in a house that shook when his father came home. He had learned that fear was information and that information could be worked with. He was also 23 years old and running a school that had 14 students on its best week. And that was not making enough money to cover its operating costs, and that sat on the wrong end of a street in a city that had no particular reason to believe in him. He was not impervious to uncertainty. He was not operating from a position of unshakable confidence. He was a young man who had found his thing and who was trying to build it in the world without any guarantee that the world wanted it built. All of that was true. And what was also true was that he had been standing in the center of his school alone for 40 minutes when 3 men walked in, and one of them had just asked him to prove that what he did was real. He said, "All right." He moved some of the equipment to the edges of the floor. He gave Cavett a brief explanation of the terms under which they would spar, which were essentially that it would be controlled, that the intention was to demonstrate technique rather than to injure, that they could stop at any time. Cavett listened to this with the polite tolerance of a man who was not planning to require any of it. They faced each other in the center of the floor. What Cavett had, and it was real, was size and strength and a particular physical intelligence developed through years of manual work and a handful of confrontations that had required him to be effective in a hurry. He was not a trained fighter. He was something more dangerous in a narrow sense, which is to say he was a large, strong man who was not afraid and who had no technique to unlearn. He came forward with a confidence that was not bravado. He simply did not see a reason to be cautious. Chuck moved. What happened in the next 40 seconds is difficult to describe in the terms usually used to describe physical confrontations, because the terms usually available are about force meeting force, about one man overpowering another, And that is not what occurred. What occurred was a demonstration of the principle that is at the center of every serious martial art, which is that the efficient application of technique removes the relevance of size and strength as deciding factors. This is not a romantic idea. It is a mechanical one. Chuck had spent 4 years learning to move his body and other bodies in space with an efficiency that made the comparison of raw physical attributes beside the point, and he had refined this learning through the particular discipline of a man who reviews his notebook at the end of every week and makes adjustments. Cavett moved forward. Chuck was not where he had been. The angle had changed. The distance had changed. And before Cavett had fully registered the change, there was a hand at his wrist and a pressure at his elbow, and the floor was coming up. And then it arrived, and he was on it, on his back, looking up at the flat white industrial light fixture in the ceiling of the building that had been a hardware store, and before that, a dry goods outlet. And the young man in the white uniform was standing above him with his hands at his sides and a look on his face that was not triumph and was not contempt, and was, as best as Cavett could identify it in the moment, something like consideration. Sutton and Almanza stood near the door and did not move. Cavett lay on the floor for a moment. He was not hurt. He was, by his own subsequent account, more surprised than he had been in a long time, which was its own kind of experience for a man who had stopped being surprised by physical things at around the age of 20. He got up. He looked at Chuck. Chuck said nothing. Cavett said, "How do you do that?" Chuck looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Come to class on Monday." And here is the thing that happened, which is the thing that matters more than the physical event that preceded it. Cavett came. He came on Monday, and he paid the enrollment fee, which was $12 a month, and he trained. He was not a natural athlete in the specific sense that martial arts requires naturalness, but he was strong, and he was stubborn, and he was, it turned out, genuinely curious. He trained at the school for the better part of a year, and Chuck taught him with the same patience and specificity with which he taught everyone, and Cavett became, if not a skilled practitioner of Tang Soo Do, then something more useful than that, which was an honest one. Before Cavett left that Saturday afternoon, standing in the doorway while Sutton and Almanza went out ahead of him, he stopped and looked back at Chuck. He said, "I thought you'd be bigger." Chuck said, "Everybody does." Cavett nodded once and went out. The school on Exchange Avenue was not a success in any commercial sense during the time Chuck ran it. It never had more than 30 regular students. It rarely covered its operating costs. Chuck supplemented his income with teaching work and with the occasional construction job and with the careful management of a budget that had no margin in it. He stayed in Fort Worth for 2 more years before the pull of the larger martial arts world and the beginnings of what would eventually become a tournament circuit in California brought him west. He closed the school in 1965 and moved to Torrance, where he would eventually open the school that Richard Elway would walk into 7 years later. But before he left Fort Worth, something had been established, not in the world, which had not noticed, but in him. There's a difference between knowing what you are capable of in conditions that are structured and supervised and knowing it in conditions that are not. And the afternoon in March of 1963 was the second kind of knowledge. It was not the most important moment in the development of Chuck Norris as a martial artist. It was not even close to the most important. He would go on to compete at levels and in contexts that made the school on Exchange Avenue look like a footnote, and he would lose fights that mattered more and learn more from losing than he had learned that afternoon from winning. But it was the first time he had been tested in the open, without the structure of tournament rules and the mutual agreement of competitors who both understood the terms. And what he discovered was not that he was invincible. He was very specifically not invincible, and he knew this. What he discovered was that the thing he had built through 4 years of study and the obsessive repetition of movements in quiet rooms in Korea and in Fort Worth was real. It worked when the conditions were not ideal. It worked when the other person was not there to be a training partner, but to be a problem that needed solving. And it had worked not through force, not through imposing his will on a stronger man, but through the application of understanding. He had been a shy boy from Ryan, Oklahoma, who had grown up in houses that shook and moved too often, and had found in the martial arts a language that made sense to him in a way that most things had not. He had studied that language with the seriousness of someone who understands that they have found the thing they were made for. And the afternoon in March had been the first real test of whether the thing he had built was solid, or whether it was the kind of solid that only holds in controlled conditions. It held. This is not a dramatic statement. Chuck would not have described it as dramatic. He would have described it as information, the same way he described most things, as data to be recorded in a notebook and reviewed at the end of the week and incorporated into the adjustments. What he learned that afternoon would not fit neatly in a notebook, but it was the same category of thing, something that told him more about the current state of the system than he had known before. He trained that evening, as he always did. He worked the forms. He recorded the session. He went home to the apartment near his mother's house and ate and slept and got up the next morning and went back to the school. The year after Chuck left Fort Worth, Roy Cavett started a martial arts class at the VFW Hall in Northside. He did not have a rank or a formal lineage. He had 12 months of instruction at a small school on Exchange Avenue and a willingness to pass on what he had received. The class met twice a week and had, at its peak, 9 students. It lasted 3 years before Cavett moved back to Weatherford for work. He told the story of that Saturday afternoon many times over the years, always in the same way, without embellishment, with the particular accuracy of someone who is telling a story in which they are not the hero. The young man had not been big. He had moved, and then Cavett was on the floor, and it had not hurt, which was somehow more unsettling than if it had. And then the young man had offered him the thing he had just demonstrated, had held it out like it was something available to anyone willing to come back Monday. The thing that Cavett always ended on, telling this story, was not the fall, and it was not the skill, and it was not even the Monday invitation, which was remarkable in its own right. What he always ended on was the look on the young man's face, standing above him with his hands at his sides. He wasn't proud of himself, Cavett would say. He wasn't performing for me or for Sutton and Pete standing at the door. He just looked at me like he was thinking about the next thing, like I was a problem he'd solved and now he was thinking about the next problem. He would shake his head a little. I have never seen that look on anybody else. The school on Exchange Avenue closed in 1965. The building was subsequently a barber shop, then a tax preparation office, then a vacant space for several years, then a taqueria that was still operating as of the early 1990s. The hand-painted sign that read Norris Karate was taken down when Chuck left and does not appear in any surviving photographs. The $12 monthly fee, the notebook, the forms worked alone in the afternoon, the careful management of a budget with no margin, these things left no record. They exist only in what came after, in the architecture of the man who built himself in that empty room during those 2 years in Fort Worth, working without witnesses, working because the work was the thing, working because somewhere in the discipline of a body and mind, subjected to consistent and honest labor, a boy from Ryan, Oklahoma, was finding out who he was and what he was worth. Fort Worth, Texas, March 1963.